Part 1, The Forgotten Princess. Lien had always known she was different. From the moment she could walk, she had been aware of the whispers that followed her like shadows. The Valor, a race of towering, iridescent warriors, valued strength, elegance, and dominance above all else. Lien, however, was none of these things. Where her kin stood tall and imposing, she was small and delicate. Where their skin shimmered with the light of their lineage, hers barely caught the glow. She was the forgotten princess, the one who had been set aside from the moment she was born. The first time Lien attended a royal banquet, she was 6 years old. Even then, she had mastered the art of making herself invisible. It was easier than one might think, even for a princess. The Valor court was a place of sharpened laughter, whispered alliances, and veiled insults. Lien had learned to navigate it with a quiet grace, her presence barely noticed by the towering figures around her. She had been seated at the farthest edge of the great hall, beneath the towering glass arches of the imperial dining chamber. The goblet in her hand was more of a prop than anything else, a way to keep her hands busy as she watched the court ignore her. At 26, little had changed. Lien was still the forgotten princess, still seated at the edge of the room, still twirling the stem of her goblet between her fingers. The Valor court was at its usual games, the men posturing, the women engaging in their silent wars. No one spoke to Lien, no one even looked at her. And that was fine, truly, because it gave her the chance to watch them instead. Tonight, there was someone, very interesting to watch. The human. He was the only one sitting like he belonged in a bar rather than a royal banquet. His shoulders were squared, his posture relaxed, as if he had decided to make himself comfortable in a place where he clearly did not belong. Lien had never seen a human before. She had heard of them, of course, fragile creatures, soft and warm-blooded, laughably weak compared to the towering figures of the Valor. And yet, this one sat with the lazy confidence of a man who didn't care. He wasn't enormous, not by Valor standards, but he was solid, compact, broad-shouldered, and long-limbed. His clothing was simple, dark, and practical, a stark contrast to the shimmering silks and jeweled robes of the Valor court. His expression, at this very moment, was one of deep, profound suffering. Lien tilted her head, intrigued. "You're staring," a voice murmured beside her. Lien blinked, turning to the only person at the table who ever acknowledged her existence, Kos, her cousin, and the only member of the royal family with a sense of humor. "Am I?" she asked, lifting her goblet to her lips. Kos smirked. "Be careful. I hear humans are high maintenance." Lien snorted into her drink. She had never had much interest in off-worlders before, but this one was entertaining in a way she hadn't expected. His expression had now shifted from suffering to outright despair as he poked at the dish placed before him, a delicate arrangement of Valor cuisine, elegantly plated but almost certainly inedible to human biology. As if sensing her amusement, the human glanced up. For a brief, suspended moment, their eyes met across the vast hall. Lien arched a brow. The human, to her surprise, did not look away. He grinned, a slow, lopsided thing that made him look like he was in on some private joke with the universe. Then, without breaking eye contact, he very deliberately picked up a piece of something that was absolutely poisonous to his species and popped it into his mouth. Lien's eyes widened. She had barely processed what he had done before Kos let out a delighted laugh. "By the stars," he murmured. "He's either an idiot or he's trying to impress you." Lien felt her lips twitch. "Then he's about to impress me straight into a medical emergency," she murmured back. Across the hall, the human was still grinning, but the edges of it were starting to look strained. "Oh, this is going to be fun," Kos said, sounding entirely too entertained. Lien sighed, pushing her chair back and rising. She was not particularly interested in humans, but she was even less interested in watching one die from his own stubbornness. And if nothing else, this one was at least amusing enough to be worth saving. Part 2, The Human's Gamble. Elias Vance had experienced many levels of regret in his lifetime. There was the time he had taken a shortcut through a Nibari swamp planet and discovered, quite violently, that its native flora had very strong opinions about being stepped on. There was the diplomatic summit where he had mispronounced the name of a Korean trade ambassador and accidentally proposed marriage. And then there was this moment, sitting in a room full of towering alien aristocrats, staring across the table at a very small, very amused Valor princess, while his throat burned like he had just swallowed liquid sun fire. The food had seemed harmless enough, elegant, delicately arranged, a small, shimmering bite of something that looked like sushi if sushi had been engineered by a civilization that had never once considered whether their cuisine might murder a human on contact. Elias swallowed, feeling the heat spread through his chest like a slow-moving supernova. He had made several mistakes in his career, but eating that was about to be one of the biggest. His instincts, the smart ones, the ones that kept him alive, were already screaming at him to stay very, very still. The moment he made a move, the Valor court would know something was wrong, and the last thing he needed was to cause an intergalactic incident by vomiting up the royal family's finest delicacy in front of 100 witnesses. Across the table, the princess, Lien, he remembered now, the one everyone had been ignoring, was watching him with a knowing look, her lips twitching. "How's it taste, human?" Her voice was light, almost too casual. Elias exhaled carefully through his nose. His vision blurred slightly. He could still recover from this. He just needed to lie. "Not bad," he rasped, smiling through the sheer agony of his entire digestive system catching fire. Lien's lips parted in delight. "Really? Most species can't tolerate that much neurotoxin." Elias froze. He re-evaluated every single decision that had brought him to this moment. Neurotoxin? Lien rested her chin on one hand, looking far too entertained. "Mild one. Don't worry, won't kill you. Probably," she mused, "it's possible you'll survive without permanent damage. Or you might develop a second heart. That happened once to a visiting Malari diplomat." He was quite pleased with the results. Elias stared at her. He had the distinct feeling she was messing with him. Probably. Hopefully. Maybe. Before he could decide whether or not to panic, someone cleared their throat at the head of the table. The Valor King, Lien's father, was watching the exchange with a bemused expression, his long fingers drumming lightly against the polished surface of the banquet table. His voice, when he finally spoke, was smooth and cool, effortlessly commanding the attention of the room. "It seems our human guest has unexpected tastes." A ripple of laughter moved through the assembly. Nobles, not cruel, Valor humor was rarely cruel, but certainly interested. Elias took another slow breath, ignoring the burning sensation still crawling down his spine. He had two choices here: first, admit he had just poisoned himself by accident and become the subject of diplomatic pity for the rest of his mission, or second, commit to the bit. He smiled. "I hear it builds character," he said lightly. "Or at least it's a great way to figure out if my will is up to date." Part 3, The Claim. Elias had exactly 3 seconds of peace after the words left his mouth, 3 beautiful, fleeting seconds where he was still blissfully unaware of the diplomatic disaster he had just detonated. Then the entire hall exploded into pandemonium. Nobles surged to their feet, voices overlapping in an uproar of disbelief. Someone knocked over a ceremonial fruit platter. Someone else actually fainted. A Valor noble at the far end of the table made a strangled noise and dropped his goblet in pure, undiluted horror. Lien, seated across from Elias, had frozen mid-drink. Her golden eyes blinked once, then twice. Then, slowly, she lowered her goblet and exhaled very, very carefully. Kos, meanwhile, was watching the chaos unfold with the barely contained glee of a man who had just witnessed his least favorite cousin accidentally activate a self-destruct sequence. "Oh, this is spectacular," he murmured. Elias frowned. "I feel like I just did something either really clever or really dumb." "Both," Lien gasped, still laughing. "Absolutely both." Voss, humiliated beyond reason, pushed to his feet, rage tightening his jaw. "This is unacceptable. The claim must be invalidated." "Actually," Lien cut in, her voice calm, "it's not." The court fell silent. Elias blinked at her. Lien, still smiling, stepped into the ring and turned to her father, the king, who had been watching the entire ordeal with mild fascination. "You always taught us that strength was about adaptation," she said smoothly. "That true power isn't just brute force, but cleverness." The king's lips twitched. Lien continued, tilting her head. "Elias won his duel. He proved himself worthy. And if I recall the law correctly," she placed a deliberate hand on Elias's shoulder, "that means his claim stands." The tension in the room shifted. The Valar nobles exchanged looks. Some scowled, others considered. And Elias, still catching up, squinted at her. "Wait," he muttered. "So we're actually doing this?" Lien arched a brow. "Do you want to back out now?" Elias hesitated. This had started as a dumb joke, a sarcastic quip at a fancy dinner, a diplomatic accident. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. Maybe it was the way Lien had laughed. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time, people were actually looking at her, seeing her, not as a forgotten princess, not as a fragile footnote in her own kingdom's history, but as someone worth noticing. And maybe, just maybe, Elias liked being the idiot who had made that happen. He exhaled, then turned back to the king. "All right," he said, grinning. "Guess I'm in." The king studied him for a long moment. Then, to everyone's shock, he chuckled. "Very well," he said. "The claim stands." And just like that, Elias Vance, the human diplomat who had come to Valar Prime expecting a boring trade negotiation, became the most scandalous consort in Valar history. Part 4, The Aftermath. The galaxy lost its mind. The news spread at light speed. Every major holonet, every interstellar gossip feed, every political analyst had opinions. Humans, universally overlooked in intergalactic nobility, were suddenly a topic of discussion. Lien, once ignored, was now the most famous princess in the sector. Elias mostly spent his time dodging assassination attempts from angry, rejected Valar nobles. "Let me get this straight," he muttered one night, as he and Lien sat on the palace balcony, watching the city lights below. "I start my day as a diplomat, make one bad joke, and end my day accidentally betrothed to an alien princess." Lien smirked. "Some men just have that kind of luck." Elias exhaled. "You're enjoying this way too much." "Absolutely." He glanced at her, considering. "And you're really okay with this?" Lien tilted her head. She had spent her whole life ignored, unwanted. Now, people noticed. Now, she had options. And perhaps most importantly, now she had someone who had chosen her, just as she was. She smiled. "I think I can work with it," she said. Elias grinned. "Well, that makes one of us." And in the distance, across the stars, the galaxy kept screaming.